Welcome, everyone. I'm Dick Deming. I'm Medical Director of Mercy One Cancer Center and the founder of Above and Beyond Cancer. Welcome to our weekly cancer education series. It's brought to you in part by a grant from the Iowa Oncology Society. And our talk tonight is about water quality in Iowa. And our guest is Adam Shriver. Adam is the Director of Wellness and Nutrition Policy at the Harkin Institute. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks. Very happy to be here. It's exciting.
So we are going to talk about something that's very important and has become more important as we realize that Iowa is second in the nation in terms of incidence of cancer. And many of us are wondering the relationship between our environment and cancer. But before we dive into that, let's get to know you a little bit. So where are you from originally? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Ames, Iowa.
Okay.
Yep. And
Ames High School.
Yep. Ames High.
Okay. So what was your claim to fame in high school?
Gosh, I was probably the main thing in my mind was I was the number 2 singles player in tennis. And so I was very intensely competitive about it.
And did you go to the state tournament?
I came really close. We were like so close to making. We were playing a doubles match, and we just like barely lost in a tiebreaker in the third set. And if we had won, we would have made it.
So do you still play tennis?
Not as much as I should. Yeah, I really.
Who's going to win the U.S. Open?
I don't know. It's between Alcaraz and Sinner. They seem like they're always one of them. Yeah. So.
And then when you graduated from high school, where did you go next?
So I went to Iowa State University. Then I did a master's degree at Texas A&M.
Okay, back to Iowa State. What was your first major when you first started?
Philosophy, actually. Yeah,
okay.
So kind of a distant major for my
And then what did you end up with?
So I ended up with a PhD in a program called Philosophy, Neuroscience, Psychology at Washington University in St. Louis.
So you did graduate with an undergraduate degree in philosophy.
Yeah, philosophy.
And then did you work or did you go right on to graduate school?
Well, actually, I guess it's relevant for today. I went for 2 years in an AmeriCorps program called Massachusetts Community Water Watch. And I was a campus organizer where I basically worked with students where we did stream quality monitoring and organized cleanups of rivers and did some environmental education in local schools.
And did you have a real interest in the environment and conservation in high school and undergrad?
Yeah, I think it was always something I cared a lot about, and probably, I guess, more towards senior year of college, I really started getting passionate about it. So,
okay. Yeah. So as an undergrad philosophy major, who was your favorite philosopher?
Oh, my favorite philosopher. Oh, gosh. I think, I am a big fan of Henry Sidgwick. He's someone who, so there's this view known as utilitarianism, which is kind of associated with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And Sidgwick was someone who didn't get as much attention, but he was really systematic and careful thinker. So yeah, he was one of my favorites.
And then on to graduate school, and you had a PhD in philosophy?
Yeah, philosophy, neuroscience, psychology. So it was an interdisciplinary program with the idea being looking at cognitive science to try to address some of these age-old philosophical questions.
And that was in Texas?
That was at Washington University in St. Louis.
Oh, St. Louis. Great.
Yeah.
And what was the title of your thesis?
The title of my thesis was The Asymmetrical Contributions of Pleasure and Pain to Well-Being. So it was looking at the neuroscience of our pleasure and pain systems and basically arguing that in philosophical theorizing, they kind of treat pleasure and pain as two sides of the same coin. But if you look at the neuroscience, they actually function pretty differently. And so you can't just assume that what you say about one of them is sort of inversely true about the other one.
Okay. I'm a big believer in the power of suffering. But we'll talk about that.
Oh, that sounds like a really deep conversation.
Yeah. So you are currently, as I mentioned, the Director of Wellness and Nutrition Policy at the Harkin Institute. When did you begin at the Harkin Institute?
I started shortly after COVID. So I was at University of Oxford during COVID, and then my grant ran out. And so my wife and I also thought it'd be better to kind of be back near family. So we came back to the US, and when I was at Oxford, if you don't mind me saying more
No,
about that.
and was that a postdoc?
Yeah, it was a postdoctoral fellowship. And
Wow.
when I was there, we worked with a group called the Oxford Martin School, and they had this project called the Future of Food, where they were basically looking at the environmental implications of different food systems. And so I was really excited about that topic. And growing up, and since I had a background from Iowa, a lot of it really resonated with me. So when I came back to Iowa, I was looking for ways to get involved. And I was really fortunate to be part of this Kellogg Foundation grant that was working to develop what they called a good food plan for the state of Iowa. So like a policy plan of sort of a progressive vision of what the food system could look like. And through that grant, I was able to work with the Harkin Institute as a research fellow. And then a couple years later, then I kind of got bumped up into the interim director of wellness position. And now I'm the director of wellness and nutrition.
How do you utilize your knowledge and expertise in philosophy in your daily work life?
I love philosophy as a major. Like, I feel like it really trains you to think critically because you're basically struggling with questions that no one has any obvious answers to. And so it's easy to kind of just throw up your hands and say, oh, well, there's no way to answer this. But what I love about philosophy is it's basically people trying their hardest to come up with some sort of defensible, systematic way of addressing these really challenging questions. And so I think it kind of prepares you for other types of work by helping you think about how to evaluate evidence, how to evaluate arguments, thinking about how different premises may or may not lead to certain conclusions. So, yeah, so I guess I sort of see it as, I'm sure lots of different majors like have their center their own perspective, but I feel like philosophy is in some ways kind of foundational in terms of thinking about how we critically evaluate information.
No, that's a really good point. It's not just when you mention philosophy, everybody thinks, navel gazing about the meaning of life, and that's part of it. But there are other questions that maybe aren't that big that philosophy also helps to, figure out in terms of the best way to live life, or the positive and negative aspects of various perspectives, and how you approach what is the role of government in the pursuit of happiness.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's shift gears back to our topic tonight, and that is kind of the intersection between the environment and cancer. But that sort of presumes that there is this intersection. And as a philosopher and someone who believes in argument and evidences and data is an important part of what we need to know before we can make conclusions.
Yeah, for sure.
And Harkin Institute has been part of that. So a couple of things that I'd like to talk about. And one is in August of this year, just last month, there was an important event that the Harkin Institute helped sponsor on the campus of Drake. And that was the release of the Currents of Change, a report on the status of water quality, the rivers and streams of Iowa.
Yeah.
So maybe tell us a little bit, set the groundwork for what that study was, how it came into being, and then we'll dive into what it shows.
Yeah, so basically a couple years ago, John Norris was the administrator of Polk County, and he received some funding from Biden's Recovery Act grant and decided he wanted to take a closer look at what's happening in Iowa waterways. So, of course, people had known for a while that there had been challenges facing the waterways, but he wanted to do a really systematic study where he was looking at what things have been done, what's the complete body of scientific knowledge that we have about this, are the things that we're doing actually addressing the problem. And so he hired someone named Jen Terry, and she put together this team of really top-notch scientists from Iowa and also outside of Iowa. I think it was 16 scientists to put together this really comprehensive report. And so I remember them quoting the statistic, they worked 4,400 hours to put together this report where it was basically a very long report detailing lots of things about central Iowa waterways, including the history of land use. So all the way back to sort of pre-colonial settlement to nowadays, and how the land has changed, how the river flow has changed, and then leading to the issues that are kind of facing us today about questions about our drinking water quality, risks for swimming in beaches and in streams, challenges facing the natural environment. So it was this really nice comprehensive report, and also included some recommendations at the end.
And we've known for a long time that our waters, so probably close to 80% of the land of Iowa is under cultivation, and the modern farming includes the use of lots of chemicals. And there's also lots of nitrates in the form of fertilizers, some of which are industrial, but then also manure that is used not only as fertilizer, but just also the livestock industry, and all of that gets into the waterway. And for some time, we've been testing the quality of water around the state and looking at various things like nitrates. And several years ago, we came up with a nutrient reduction policy, because we've known for a long time that the waters of the upper Midwest, a lot of nutrients, basically nitrate, flow into the river and end up in the Gulf of Mexico and cause all sorts of havoc there. So we've tried to come up with a strategy for how to reduce the nutrients that go into our rivers and end up eventually in the Gulf of Mexico. And one of the statistics at the report was that, we wanted to reduce the nutrients in the river by 25% over the course of, 10, 15 years. And over the course of that period of time, what happened?
Well, I know it increased. Did it double or something?
I think it's like tripled.
Tripled?
Instead of
Yeah.
reducing by certain percentage, it just swelled.
Yeah.
And one of the points is the Nutrient Reduction Act was just suggestions on what to do to try to keep all of these nutrients, nitrate-based products, to get into the river, but there weren't really any public policy that had any sort of incentives or penalties. And so as a result, the stating that was our goal didn't accomplish it, and far from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the points John Norris makes is that, there's a lot of talk about, well, we spent millions of dollars, improving different agricultural practices around the state. And of course, from a public policy perspective, what you want to see is, are you actually addressing the problem that you're setting out to address? And so when you hear a bunch of statistics thrown out about how much money was spent, if it's not actually addressing the problem, if the problem is actually getting worse, then that suggests that, there might be a need for course correction. And, I think the big sort of debate now is it enough to just try to incentivize farmers to change their practices by giving them money to sort of, do things? Or is there a need for regulation, or is there a need to tie, some of the money that's given to farmers to changing some of their practices? So I think there's kind of this big swirling set of questions around what policy would actually fix this.
And we mentioned agriculture, but when we look at what is the cause, so clearly the water quality has diminished, and so we look at what is the cause of the water quality going down. So some of it is clearly man-made in terms of urban and industrial. So it's not all agriculture. Some is related to the erosion that then contributes to more flow coming into the rivers. And then some is related to agriculture, certainly the growing of crops and the chemicals, but then also livestock
Mhm.
and the manure that comes in. What was your takeaway of the report? And by the way, our audience can access the report on the Polk County website. It's called Currents of Change, and there's a multiple several hundred page report, but there's also a very nice 5-page summary, Currents of Change executive summary. So set the stage for what's the current state of water quality in Iowa.
Yeah, well, I guess one thing to mention too is just originally the county wasn't going to present the findings. They were just going to sort of release the report into the record. And so I went to the Board of Supervisors meeting and just sort of offered for the Harkin Institute to host this presentation. And it turned out to just be incredibly like it was such a huge topic that 600 people showed up in person. Now 2,800 people have watched it on YouTube. So it just is something that really captured the attention of people in central Iowa. And I think the reason for that is because, of course, we had the lawn watering ban this summer, which is because the world's most expensive nitrate removal system, or at least when it was originally installed, it was the most expensive, couldn't keep up with all the nitrates in our water. So they had to do a lawn watering ban in order to reduce the amount of water that they had to treat.
Right. It's not that we didn't have enough water. There was lots of rain, lots of water in the rivers. It's sort of like water everywhere, but we couldn't clean it fast enough to get it into the pipes to allow people to use it for watering lawns.
Exactly. So we couldn't do that, but even on, that was just one issue, but I think we're kind of constantly facing news about water quality in Iowa. Every week there's new reports about which beaches you're not supposed to swim at. There was news a couple weeks ago about a settlement for one of the largest fish kills in state history, where like 50 miles of river was just completely, all the fish were killed from a leak from an agricultural containment unit. So we're sort of just like constantly getting this news about water quality. And so I think that the takeaways from the presentation for me was that, they did analysis, and they found that 80% of the nitrates that were in the central Iowa region were coming from agriculture. So it is, something that is connected to different agricultural practices. So that was probably like the main thing that kind of jumped out at me. And also the fact that we already mentioned that even though we're spending all this money, the problem is not getting better, it's getting worse.
And it's the state of our water affects many things. And again, this were scientists doing scientific studies, but you look at the ecology and wildlife, how that is affected by the water quality. You look at obviously drinking water, and we'll talk a little bit about nitrate and why we focus on nitrates, but you also look at the recreational potential of the rivers and lakes. Right now, there's a major project to improve and enhance the recreational quality, but there's a little concern about, okay, we might make all of these landings to put in boats and canoes and kayaks, but then the warnings come out that you're not supposed to actually be in the water. So that's affected as well. But back to the science. We've talked a lot about nitrates, and we know with certainty some of the health consequences of nitrates, and that's why that's one of the contaminants in the water that we pay particular attention to. We know that it can cause problems with infants, but it also has been shown to increase the risk of certain types of cancer, in particular endometrial and thyroid and colon cancer. And again, those of us in the cancer world are still searching for why is Iowa number 2 in the nation in terms of incidence of cancer, and only one of 2 states where the incidence is actually going up. And nitrate sort of is one of those suspects.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you mentioned, there's worries about how it affects infants, and there's an EPA limit on how much nitrate is allowed in the water, and that's based on this blue baby syndrome. And so it's 10 milligrams per liter is set as a way of protecting infants. But as you noted, there's several studies and several, I guess, kind of meta-analyses that show that even lower amounts of nitrate, maybe even 5 milligrams per liter, or there have been studies that shown even less, could actually increase the risk of cancer. So so that's a big important thing that needs to be paid attention to. Yeah.
And in addition to nitrate, there's all sorts of other chemicals, but our knowledge of what's a safe amount of those chemicals is really quite limited.
Yeah, it's definitely a work in progress for quite a few of them. I think nitrates maybe is one where it's been studied quite a bit, but yeah, there are lots of different pesticides where we're still learning about their impact.
So the water quality report indicates that we have a lot to learn, but also a lot to do to try to mitigate against all of these nutrients and nitrates and other chemicals getting into the river. What were some of the suggested next steps from the panel that came up with the that presented the Currents of Change report?
Yeah, well, they recommended different watershed districts, sort of like in every region of the state, having watershed districts that were sort of monitoring the situation. And I mean, one huge thing is that the state cut funding to the system of monitoring nitrates. That Iowa had the sort of best system in the world, and the state actually cut funding to it. And the Walton Family Foundation stepped in and said, well, we'll fund this for a couple of years, but we're absolutely not going to fund it for longer than that. It's just a stopgap.
So we've had a very extensive system of actually measuring water quality throughout the state.
Yeah, it's very extensive. I mean, just to be clear, there are still a lot of areas in the state where there's not enough measurement. Like a lot of people have private wells, and so there's a lot of concern that they might have issues that they're not aware of. But in terms of measuring the sort of larger bodies of water, there was this really extensive monitoring system, and the state cut funding to it. Inexplicably, or I guess, surprisingly. And so one of the huge recommendations, of course, is that we just need to improve the monitoring and restore funding to that, and also look into actually increasing monitoring. There's also, I think one of the interesting recommendations was just sort of thinking about what the agricultural system looks like. And we're in Iowa, we're kind of in this corn, soybean, CAFO kind of system where, that's the majority of the economy, but there are other ways of growing crops and growing diversified crops that may have less of an impact on different environmental issues. So that was another suggestion that they put in there that I thought stood out as being interesting.
And one of the takeaways that I thought was interesting is, we have this thing called a point source. And so if you were an industry and you have runoff from your industry through a pipe into the river, I mean, that's a point source. You measure it, and you can then hold accountable the industry that is bringing that there. But that it's not allowed to think of agriculture as a point source. So even if you have acres of land with a tiling system and everything comes into the river through a pipe, that's not considered a point source. And that perhaps, just like we make industry that's not agriculture limit how much can come through, what if we said the same thing, and with a large parcel of agriculture land that drains through a pipe, and we say, here is the limit of that nutrient that can come here, that might be one way to hold accountable. And, people in agriculture don't want to put more stuff on their land that just runs off. That's not economically um, wise. So knowing how much runoff there is might be one of the steps to then creating public policy that would reduce the runoff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, yeah, that question of treating agriculture as non-point source, of course, was a sort of controversial decision by the EPA, and it does have implications for how strongly any of this stuff can be regulated.
The report also goes into health consequences related to the nutrient burden and things like algae blooms and other pathogens, viruses and bacteria in the water that can make it not safe for individuals to be in the water. And as you pointed out, many of our recreation sites are shut down, or there are notices to discourage people from getting into the water because of things like the nitrate level or the algae bloom or the E. coli level that happens as a consequence of all of this runoff.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's a huge issue that affects people's quality of life. And I think, I mean, you can just look at the comparison between Iowa and Minnesota to some extent, where, so many people in Iowa travel to Minnesota for recreation and to get out on the lakes and get out on the water. And Minnesota has, a different set of regulations than we do. And I think it shows to some extent in how much people are inclined to engage in recreation there versus in Iowa.
So let's shift a little bit now and talk about a project that the Harkin Institute is doing in conjunction with the Iowa Environmental Council. And again, getting back to something that we've said many times, and that is the incidence of cancer in Iowa. The only state that has a higher incidence of cancer is Kentucky. And in part because they have a very high incidence of smoking in Kentucky that probably contributes to their excess number of cancer cases. When we look at Iowa and we look at the usual suspects for modifiable risk factors, which is cigarette smoking, the type of food we eat, exercise or lack of exercise, alcohol consumption, sun exposure, those things we're kind of in the middle category with other states, but yet we have this super high incidence. A couple of things that stands out with Iowa that are very different than the surrounding states, and one is the amount of radon that we have in our bedrock. It's not a pollutant. It's there naturally. We know it causes lung cancer. It probably also contributes to other cancer, and that's probably one of the explanations. But the other is you look at just an aerial view of Iowa, and you see the amount of chemicals per square mile that are spread across Iowa that eventually get into the water stream. It's hard to imagine that doesn't contribute in some way. But we're scientists and we want to know the facts. So the first thing that is being done is the Harkin Institute, in conjunction with the Iowa Environmental Council, is doing a deep dive into what do we know about the relationship between all of these chemicals and cancer.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the project and how it's coming along.
Yeah, well, I'll back up a little just to put it totally in context where, we had this conference last September during the release of a book called Industrial Farm Animal Production, the Environment, and Public Health. So it was a book co-edited by Dr. James Merchant, who was the former dean of the Iowa College of Public Health, and also Robert Martin, who was at Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. And so they asked the Harkin Institute to host this conference. And so we had this 2-day conference with all these experts who came in and talked about the connection between industrial farm animal production and health. And cancer came up quite a bit during that discussion, both from water issues, but also some air pollution questions. But I think it just generated a lot of discussion and a lot of interest. And in part, what came out of that was some donors who got really interested in this question of, how do we start addressing this question of cancer in Iowa? And so those donors were talking to us, and they were talking to Dr. Deming, and they were talking to the Iowa Environmental Council. And, we sort of got together and decided to team up and think about this question as a group. And I would be remiss to not say that Dr. Deming was very instrumental in, getting this off the ground and thinking very broadly about this topic. And so I greatly appreciate all the things that you did. And so we got together this group and thought about this issue. And like you said, we have this second highest cancer rate in Iowa, and there's a big elephant in the room, which is the fact that, we apply the most chemical fertilizers out of any state. And we also have the most animal waste in the country. I remember this statistic for some reason. It's 109 billion pounds of animal waste is produced in Iowa, which is more than any other state. So, we have these sort of big question marks in this of what's going on. And yet, at least some of us in this group felt like a lot of the discussion in the state kind of veered away from thinking about whether agriculture might be playing a role. It talked a lot about these personal risk factors, which of course are important, but also I think as scientists, we need to sort of have an open mind to all of the possible causes. So anyways, we got together and some really generous donors stepped up. Fred White's, Patsy Shore's, and Dr. Deming, and also Buzz Brenton, pitched in and sort of got this project off the ground. And then after that happened, a couple of foundations were really interested in this. So the Walton Family Foundation, Grace Communications, Builders Initiative all kind of pitched in money. And so we put together this project that's basically thinking about Iowa's high cancer rates and whether environmental contributions might be playing a role, and if so, what we can do about it. And so it was basically a sort of two-stage project. And the first stage was all about information gathering. And there were two components of that. So one component, as you mentioned, was we're conducting a scientific review of the literature of different environmental contributors and what we know in terms of correlations about what exposures are correlated with different types of cancer. And so we looked at three main things in that. So we looked at PFAS, which are these forever chemicals, which are included in a lot of things that are manufactured. We looked at nitrates on their own, and then we looked at other agricultural chemicals and specifically pesticides. So that's one component. We hired a research fellow, Elise Pohl, who worked on that over the summer, and she's now starting a PhD program at the University of Iowa, but she's continuing to work on this. So we're expecting that report to be done in the next month or so.
Right.
And
just to kind of build on that before you get to the second part.
Sure.
So, doing the actual science in the field takes millions of dollars and years to actually measure everything and then do the correlation. And over the past decades, there have been hundreds, probably thousands of papers written. So step number one was not to initiate a brand new field study going out and measuring chemicals in the fields and in humans in Iowa, but to actually do a thorough review of all the literature that already exists and what do we know from all of the papers that have been reported. So we're looking forward to that a white paper that will give us what is the state of knowledge in 2025 on relationships between these chemicals and cancer.
Yeah. And I should also mention that we have a really amazing advisory group for this paper as well. So Dr. Deming has been really helpful. Sue Madison, who's the provost of Drake, is actually a cancer epidemiologist by training. And so she is serving on this advisory committee. Mary Ward is a scientist at the NIH she's part of the agricultural health study for a long time. And so she's looked at nitrates and written review papers about nitrates and cancer. Dana Colpin is with the USGS. So we have this really nice set of scientific advisors who are overseeing the creation of this paper. So I just wanted to mention that. But yeah.
Yeah. So, and we expect that it's in draft version, but ready for presentation in a month or two.
Yeah. And so the other component of the project was we decided to host listening sessions all around the state, in part because what I mentioned earlier, where it felt like part of the conversation was often being left out when people were talking about cancer and potential causes. So the idea was just to go to different corners of Iowa and get people to share their experiences. We weren't, saying our opinion. We weren't saying this is the cause of cancer. We were just going and giving a sort of brief overview and letting people share their stories. And we went to 15 different places in Iowa, and it was really an incredible experience. I'm sure you and people in this room have kind of similar experiences, but people were sharing their own experiences with cancer. And kind of everywhere we went, there were people who said that, they sort of did everything right their whole life. They never smoked, they never drank, and yet they got cancer, and many people in their community got cancer in these different rural areas, people who were not genetically related. So it was really, a very eye-opening experience and very powerful. And the reason I mention that is that we're taking that information as well, and we're going to combine it with the scientific review as part of this larger presentation of all the information that we gathered during this first phase.
So, as you mentioned, two things. One, the white paper on the current science between the correlation or relationship between chemicals and cancer. Second, the public's personal experience. And then once we collect all of that, what would be the next step?
Yeah, so I think the next step is basically trying to figure out what we should do with this information. Like what are the ways of moving forward?
We'll release that publicly. Correct?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
All of that will be publicly released. And
yeah.
then try to determine what would be the next steps moving forward, and in terms of advocacy or public policy that might help mitigate some of the risks that we discover.
Absolutely. So we're sort of in the planning stages now. We just finished our last listening session a couple of weeks ago. We're going to get together with Iowa Environmental Council. As the project has developed, we've also had other partners join us. So the Iowa Farmers Union actually went to all the listening sessions, and they're very excited about working on this project. And we have a few other partners who are joining us. So all the partners are going to get together and try to plan out what this phase 2 will look like in terms of coming up with suggestions for how to move forward. And I'm sure policy suggestions are going to be a big part of it, is thinking about what policies might address.
Do you think that the currents of change, the water report that we spent the first part of our conversation on, that potentially could be part of the mix?
Yeah, for sure. They had many suggestions in there. So I think that definitely we could use that as a starting point for building off of policy proposals.
How can, so that we've done the final listening session, so that's been completed. I would say there's another thing that's going on in the state that people should know about, and that is up until this year, the state of Iowa has never funded any research on cancer. I mean, the university does, various universities, but the state of Iowa, through their normal budgetary process, has not done so. So this year, because of the interest of the public in what is causing our high cancer rates, $1 million has been allocated to the University of Iowa, and they've set up a blue ribbon panel to decide how to spend this $1 million. $1 million is $1 million. It's not nothing. It's not enough to, move the needle tremendously, but it'll be interesting to see what the university decides to do with the $1 million. Probably doing additional studies would be an important thing, but that's also public money, and individuals can get involved in advocacy related to that blue ribbon panel that is at the University of Iowa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm interested to see what it will look like too. I sort of heard through the rumor mill that it's not going to be spent on looking at any of the possible environmental contributors to cancer, but I hope they prove me wrong. So.
Yeah, and we do know that there are many other factors, and in fact, cigarette smoking still in the state where we only have fewer than 15% of individuals smoking, it's still the number one contributor to cancer. And right along with it are the trifecta of eating too many highly processed foods, obesity, and the lack of physical activity. So we don't want to ignore those things that we know about.
Yeah.
We just want to also contribute to the literature, because when you look at the top 10 modifiable risk factors, the environment isn't one of those right now, and probably is underrepresented in our knowledge of what may be contributing to our cancer rates.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, because I think, it's important to make sure that you don't diminish the role all of these other things are playing. And I think that can't be stated enough. So, yeah.
Well, let's open it up to questions. So we've got a live studio audience. They get first dibs on the questions. If you're watching us live streaming right now, you can put your question in the comment section of the software that you're using right now to watch us. So up first, Poon, you get the first question.
Thank you. So a lot of us have gone to the reverse osmosis system. So it's filtering out 99% of everything that's not good for us and things that are good too. Are you guys recommending that we add back some of those important minerals to our water?
You know, Poon, I think there's two questions out of there. So one maybe would be, what's the recommendation about using water filtration? Is that going to reduce the risk of getting cancer? And then the second would be, when you use that, are you taking some good things out that you need to put back in? So I'm not an expert on that. Let me just say that at the water report with the scientists doing their presentation, they specifically asked, should we be filtering our water? And then specifically, are you, the scientist who presented? And the answer was yes, that they felt. Now, no one's done a study on let's say we take two towns and we do reverse osmosis on this whole town, and we do 20 years of analysis, did they get cancer? And then we do as control group. I mean, that's sort of, but not having a controlled study, the logic was that you probably are reducing your risk by using a reverse osmosis filtration. So that was the answer at the Harkin Institute presentation on the water quality. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And and I think it brings up some other interesting social dimensions, which is, first thing to note is that your typical like Brita filters and that kind of filter do not take out nitrates from the water. So you can't assume that if you're using a Brita filter that's going to address the challenges. And so for that reason, scientists and a lot of people recommend using these reverse osmosis systems because that's the only thing that will actually sort of take out the nitrates from the water. And that's what Des Moines Water Works uses to lower it. But as was noted, they have to lower it below 10 milligrams per liter, but there's some evidence that even lower amounts can still contribute to cancer. So that's why a lot of people invest in either their own reverse osmosis machines, or you can go to Hy-Vee and get water that has been treated for reverse osmosis. You know, you can sort of pick up water from other places that is lower in nitrates. But I think that raises a really important issue, which is that you know,
There's an expense.
it's an expensive system, and so some people are going to have access to be able to afford that, and some people aren't. And you know, that it's not really a fair setup if only some people are having access to water that's low enough in nitrates where they don't have to worry about cancer.
Good point. Do you have anything to say about once you do the filtration, do you need to add good stuff back into the water?
I haven't heard anything about that. So yeah.
Tim.
Hi. We just talked about the destination, what happens on the consumer end. So let's go back to the source. So the source is actually a farmer. He farms 5,000 acres or so, and he puts herbicides, pesticides, nitrates on his land and things like that. From all your studies and things like that, you're going to be pushing that to some type of legislation maybe in the future. I don't know. But is there any type of power there to say to the seed companies, hey, and I'm going to mention a bad word here, GMO. Can you make GMO seeds that require no pesticides, no herbicides, has no nitrates in it? And boom, it's solved. What do you think of that?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I think so. Part of the way the history has evolved is that they've actually used GMOs to make some crops resistant to pesticides so that they can apply the pesticides where it kills all the stuff that isn't the crop, but allows the crop itself to survive. And so there actually has been somewhat of a inverse relationship to what you're suggesting, in the sense that the GMO has made it easier to apply larger amounts of chemicals in some of these cases. Now, that doesn't mean it's not possible to maybe come up with some technological solution to where you somehow wouldn't need pesticides or herbicides. I know there are companies that are working on ways of having the crops be better at sort of holding the nitrogen in their root systems. So there definitely are people who are looking at technological solutions, and I'm sure they will at some point be part of the solution.
Yeah, that is a good point. I am aware of the individual who, and I'm not going to be able to remember the name, from South America, who's going to be the recipient of the World Food Prize this fall, has done research. So as you know, that some plants can help fix the nitrogen from the air into the ground so that you don't have to add extra nitrates, and some bacteria can also help with that process. So there is research on how to enhance the nitrogen fixation, that plants take in the nitrogen, can fixate it into the soil. It can then serve as a natural fertilizer without adding either anhydrous ammonia or manure to do that. So I think that there is research, and that'd be great if we get to that point. So let's keep fingers crossed. Okay. We have a question over here.
Hi. So I have, related to filtration of water, I just had a question about hydrogen ionized water, where you use electrolysis of the water and then infuse molecular hydrogen in it. And in terms of reducing oxidative stress, because molecular hydrogen is known to, prevent free radicals. So I was just wondering about that kind of water and if you have any knowledge about it.
Gosh, I don't know. It sounds like you might know more about this topic, that particular system than I do. Have you?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I know our friend here is a scientist and very much interested in it, and I would say you know more about that than I do, and I'm sorry I can't answer your question.
Yeah, it's just a marketable term, but I was just wondering if it's a scam or it's legit, or if there are research studies into hydrogen ionized
and is
water.
that a process that you can purchase right now?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
It's just something I saw, researched upon. So it could be available, but just don't have enough information about it.
Well, I will actually look into that also, and the next time we meet, we can talk about that.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So, should I not be drinking tap water? Been drinking it for 60 plus years, my entire life.
I mean, I think that, yeah, that's probably, well, I mean, everything is a spectrum of risk, right? Like walking across the street, you're taking a risk. So everything you
Right.
do has some degree of risk associated with it. I mean, I think we are actually very fortunate in central Iowa where we have really good monitoring systems. And we do have a wonderful Des Moines Area Waterworks that has an incredible nitrate removal system. So they do their best to lower it as much as they can. It's still, nevertheless, I think is safer if you have some way of doing reverse osmosis to lower the amount of nitrates even further. Yeah, so I guess it's sort of it's a personal decision for everyone of, you know, how much you want to invest in some system that lowers risk a certain degree. Or, I mean, the water at Hy-Vee is not super expensive, but yeah, so I don't know, Dr. Deming.
Yeah, I would agree. It's risks and benefits, and we all figure out where we stand on certain things. So, for example, if you want to avoid cancer, you should not smoke cigarettes. If you want to avoid cancer, you should not drink alcohol. If you want to avoid cancer, you should not eat processed foods. If you want to avoid cancer, you should exercise regularly. We can answer the questions on a written test, and you know, most of us would get an A. It comes to practicality, and that's because most of us can do some of the things that are harmful and not get cancer. So it's not like playing Russian roulette or doing something where the chances that you do this one action one day leads to a 30% chance you're going to die of cancer. It's remote, but over the course of our lifetime, we know there are things we can do to reduce the risk. And some of those things are inconvenient. Some of them are expensive, and some are not practical. So it does come down to how much you want to reduce the risk. And even if you do everything right, you can still get cancer. And to what expense and inconvenience do you go to? So I certainly have no problem with drinking tap water if I'm somewhere where I can't have bottled water. I don't go to the point of smoking a cigarette just because I don't think but drinking water is a necessary thing, and that it's a cumulative effect over time. But there is no doubt that drinking tap water in Iowa, we get more, not only nitrate, but other chemicals than other states drinking their water. So risks and benefits.
I've got a couple of questions about statistics, actually. You mentioned a couple of times on the show the difference in nitrate levels that are permissible. I know in Europe it's 3 parts per million or higher is not permissible. We're running around 10 at times in the summertime here. So the question is, what do they know that we don't know? Are they alarmists over there? And what would be the reason for the disparity in those statistics?
I mean, I think Europe has had a different set of priorities in terms of their evaluations of risk benefit, and their willingness to sort of take actions to protect public safety, even if it sort of goes against some of what the larger industries want. And so my own personal opinion is that, in the US, there's a little bit more pressure to sort of do the things that support larger businesses a lot of times, and so that makes it harder to have higher regulatory standards. And so I think in Europe there's a little bit of a difference there. But your question does actually remind me of I know there was a study, I think it was Denmark, that actually where they looked at the costs and benefits of lowering the nitrate requirements, and they actually found that lowering the requirements would cost more money in terms of all the things that they needed to do on farms and for treatment. But actually, if you looked at all the health benefits in terms of how it affected the healthcare system, it actually was a net savings for them. And so I think there was another study similar to that done somewhere maybe in the US where they kind of, just an analysis. But I think it just comes down to the way that government works and how they think about protecting citizens in different countries is my view. I don't know if you have any.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think there's different risk-benefit analysis, and many of the countries, especially in Northern Europe, have a socialism-based, where there's just this philosophical concept that we do things to protect more people, and that it's not so much every man for himself. So my friend, the philosopher, could probably tell us who, is more pragmatic and in terms of, and who is more looking out for the little guy, and how do you do the most good for the most people. And those are philosophical questions that do lead to how you might impose public policy. I use the word impose, or the way you might use public policy measures to cause a greater good for a greater number of people.
Yeah, getting deep here. I guess one thing it makes me think of is just in terms, there's this, just to go way off field, there's this sort of debate about how do you measure the relative well-being of countries. And for a long time, GDP was sort of thought of as this gold standard of gross domestic product, of like the economic activity as being representative of how well a country is doing. And there's debate about whether that's really the best way of evaluating whether people are really flourishing or not. And so I think if you're looking at GDP, you might get a different answer in terms of what kind of regulations you have versus.
Right. And there are people looking at a gross happiness product, like should we measure success of a country not just by how much money they make, but how happy the population is.
Yeah.
Well, if we only had more time, we could really figure that out, but we don't. So I'm sorry we're out of time. So I apologize. We'll have to come back to this topic again, but this has been great discussion. And our guest has been Adam Shriver, the Director of Wellness and Nutrition Policy at the Harkin Institute. If you know someone that would benefit by watching this program, it will be available on demand for anyone to watch beginning tomorrow at the Above and Beyond Cancer YouTube channel, and also the Mercy Cancer Center website. I hope you join us again next week. Thanks, everyone.